Hi, Zach Couples here from ZachCouples.com. I want to thank you so much for getting access to this talk however you did. This was a talk that I had initially given when I spoke in the land of China, but I wanted to re-record it for you guys because I wanted to update some of the material, one, and I figured you probably didn't want to spend 4 hours listening to me talk, then it be translated. Me talk, then it be translated, so on and so forth. But I also think that since I gave this talk, a lot of my thoughts have differed in terms of how we're approaching some of these breathing-based strategies and how I'm thinking about respiration in general. So what initially inspired this talk for me was my time with Bill Hartman. And what happened when I was with him was he was starting to do a lot of various techniques that involved utilizing respiration to help our patients. And I remember this one patient very specifically. It was a gentleman. We were at this clinic for just one day because we had to watch over because they were missing a clinician at that point in time. And I remember this guy very well. He came to us for low back pain, had this really sweet beard. Came to us for low back pain, and his biggest thing that bothered him was he tried to touch his toes. Ow! And he couldn't do it. Couldn't do it because it hurt his back. And so we tried some traditional things. First I did a little bit of manual therapy. So I did a little manual technique to the psoas. Retested. Bent over a little bit farther. Still hurt. Okay, so let's try something else. Then I did, some traditional core stability exercise. So we hit up our bird dogs. Worked on getting the core engaged, all these types of things. Had them retest. Yeah, a little bit better. Still hurt. And so I thought, we'll try some of that breathing stuff that Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman was doing. And so I did a manual technique to his rib cage in a 3-month position, or the Levitt position, as I'll show you guys later. And we worked on some breathing, worked on getting his rib cage to move a little bit more efficiently. And as soon as we did that, he bent all the way down, touched his toesies, had absolutely no pain. And I thought, that's pretty cool. So I'm writing my SOAP note, documenting all this stuff, and I finally had my finished product. It was probably the first legible SOAP note that I ever wrote, and I gave it to Bill. And, I'm just kind of doing some reading, minding my own business, and all of a sudden Bill comes up to me, and he goes, "Is this true? Is this accurate?" In a very stern, serious voice. And I'm like, oh no, I must have screwed this up somehow. And, timid me at the time, I'm looking at him like, yeah. And all of a sudden, a huge smile comes up on his face, and he goes, "How cool is that?" And I thought, yeah, that is pretty cool. And it was from that moment on that I really started diving into respiration, finding as many materials and resources as I could on the topic, because this really, if done correctly and if done with the intent that I'm going to discuss with you guys today, it can be a very powerful type of intervention to help our clients meet their health and performance goal. And in my opinion, especially with some of the things that I have evolved to doing now, it is a very important piece in the rehabilitation process. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to appreciate some anatomy and physiology of breathing, because that's really where this foundationally lies. This is what we're trying to affect. We're trying to use anatomy in such a manner to enhance physiology. I'll show you guys how to assess breathing in the way I do. And here's the deal. We're going to be using a lot of assessment tools that are fairly reliable from a measuring standpoint and easy to see changes if you execute the techniques correctly. Because one thing that I'm finding a lot of with some of these people who purport breathing techniques of various kinds is we're looking at expansion of the rib cage in various manners, and that isn't always a reliable source, because sometimes you can trick yourself and say, oh yeah, that looks better. But if we can measure things, then we know things have improved based on whatever type of methodology we're using. Once we've gone through the assessment piece, I'll show you guys how to treat this stuff. And it's going to be very simple. It's going to be very thought-driven. It's going to be things that you can execute tomorrow in your clinic or in your strength conditioning field. This is my model. I've adapted it from something that Chris Kresser has put out with a little bit of, some Zach Couples flair. And in this model, what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize someone's health or performance. The reason why these two things are cut in half is because when you get to a certain point, you can improve health and performance. But once you get to this point, this fork in the road, you have to make a decision. Do I want to enhance performance or do I want to enhance health? Let me give you an example. If you want to be an elite level bodybuilder, I'm talking Mr. Olympia, you likely have to do some type of steroids at super physiologic doses to be able to compete at that high of a level. Because humans just simply aren't built that way. Those drugs potentially can have deleterious consequences to your health. And so if you want to go that far on that end, you have to realize that there's a cost that you have to incur from a health standpoint. On the flip side, there's some research out there showing that low-calorie diets can potentially increase your longevity, in at least animal models. In humans, it's a little bit mixed, but in some cases, this may very well be true because metabolism is slowed. But here's the thing. When you eat a low-calorie diet, you're likely not getting enough fuel to be able to perform in a sport at the highest level. So we have a disconnect between these two things when we want to push ourselves to the upper limits of either performance or health. These are the ways that I think we as movement professionals or professionals in health or functional medicine can favorably impact performance and health. We have sleep. We can educate our clients on effective sleep strategies, managing circadian rhythms, all of these types of things. Supportive nutrition. Can we get our clients on a diet that's best for them to help them meet their needs? Stress management. So can they mitigate stress effectively or utilize it effectively in such a manner that it allows them to thrive, not just survive? A new one that I'm playing with is social engagement. One of the biggest psychological risk factors for all-cause mortality, which is something I actually read today from Sapolsky, is the degree of social engagement that people have or social network. I'm not talking about Facebook fam, but I'm talking about how social are you? So if you lack that, you have a risk at dying much sooner. So I think that this social piece is very important. How can we maximize that in our clients? And then, of course, the piece that I'm going to be talking about with you guys today is the movement piece. Now, one could argue that utilizing respiration in many of the ways that people teach it could fit in the stress management side of things, which is where I would probably put something such as meditation. But what I'm going to be teaching you guys to do today via breathing is improving some of our movement and physical activity capabilities by combining respiration with various other modalities. So if we break down the movement piece a little bit more, there's 4 ways that I think we can improve movement in such a manner that it enhances or helps our clients meet their health and performance goals. The first step is knowledge, and I'll put a link in the notes to this, but I recently did a talk called Practical Pain Science that deals with this topic. And knowledge is, does the client have the knowledge or the understanding necessary to perform a given task? So for example, if someone can't understand the concept of a deadlift or doesn't understand what you're trying to ask of them, you probably have to increase their knowledge before they can do that movement. On the physical therapy side of things, if someone has a maladaptive belief such as every time I raise my shoulder up and it hurts, I'm damaging it, we need that addressed because pain and tissue damage aren't always synonymous. Variability is next. Once you've addressed knowledge, you move to variability. And that would be, does the individual that you're working with have the requisite degrees of freedom of movement necessary to perform a given task? So from my standpoint, the way I assess that is via a proxy measure. Can they actively and passively move in 3 planes? Once variability has been established, then we move on to power. And that is, does the client have the capability to produce intensity at a requisite level? So, can you produce a large amount of force? Can you do that fast? So, power training, strength training, all these types of things fit there. The last would be capacity. Does one have the ability to sustain intensity over a given time period? So think about energy systems training, think about endurance training, think about really anything that allows you to do something for a longer period of time. That's building capacity. Now, where does breathing fit into all this? With what I'm going to be showing you guys today, I put breathing retraining in the variability category. Like I said before, variability is, does one possess the degrees of freedom necessary to perform a given task? And if we look at this study here by Hamill, he goes a little bit more in depth into the definition. There's 2 kinds of variability. There's endpoint variability and coordinative variability. Endpoint variability is when you're trying to do a task, you finish at various points. And for example, let's say I'm playing a musical instrument and I'm playing a song on the guitar. Let's say Stairway to Heaven, because that's the greatest guitar song ever. Undisputed. Deal with it. So I'm playing Stairway, and I keep screwing up the notes. I'm very deliberate about trying to get from point A to point B, but I just can't seem to put it together. But maybe, after I practice for a long period of time, I can play these notes in a string. That would be endpoint variability. So when I'm at beginner level, the endpoint, the terminal sequence of events that I'm trying to produce is all over the place. Endpoint variability is something we see in beginners when they're learning to do a task. In the advanced person, it's something we rarely see. Usually they have very low endpoint variability because they can continuously reproduce the given task, whether it's playing that guitar song or if it's making a free throw in basketball. The other side, coordinated variability, is a little bit different. Now, let's take that expert. And they're playing Stairway to Heaven. And they seem to be fairly continuous or consistent with playing that song. What you're not seeing is each time they play that song, or they play a different note, there is a slight variation in how they are doing that. So, for example, the certain muscles might be working a little bit differently. They might approach hitting the chord a little bit differently, so on and so forth. Or, for example, if I'm a very good squatter and I have high coordinated variability, even if it looks the same every time that I do it, there's slight variations in each of those movements. And the research out there in this study shows that the greater variability we have within a sweet spot, you can have too much, obviously, you can also have too little, but if we can have coordinated variability within various movements, we're less likely to get hurt. That's a positive thing. That's what we're trying to achieve with some of these breathing techniques that I'm going to be showing you guys. Now, that said, how do we assess this? How do we assess that someone has coordinated variability in a squat, or when they're sprinting, or when they're playing basketball, or when they're playing that song? It's very hard for us to clinically determine that in an accurate manner. So what I'm proposing to you guys from a variability standpoint is essentially a proxy measure. And what we'll be looking at in some of this talk today would be, does the individual have active and passive movement capability in 3 planes? For example, if I have someone who has hip osteoarthritis that exhibits a capsular pattern, say they have multidirectional limitations, they can't externally or internally rotate, they can't flex and extend to the fullest degree, that person lacks variability in that joint, in the sense that they don't have enough movement options to perform given tasks. They only have a limited range of motion which they can work with. And so the amount of coordinated variability that they can express in other tasks could potentially be limited. On the flip side, let's say you have someone who is incredibly flexible, large amounts of range of motion, but they're clumsy as all hell. That person, on the flip side, has potential for a large amount of variability, but because they lack the control and coordination, they can't express that or coordinate it in such a manner that it's effective. So what we're trying to do with variability is look at joint range of motion in all three planes throughout the entire body and seeing if people can control and coordinate that. What my hope is today, with some of the very basic things that I'm going to show you, is that while I don't think it can tell us for certain that someone has coordinated variability in a given movement task, we at least give them the potential to do so. Because if we can utilize breathing and impact the testing that I'm going to show you guys today in a favorable manner, it at least gives that person the potential to express coordinated variability in a given task. And in order for us to determine if we can achieve movement variability via breathing, I think it's important that we review respiratory anatomy. Really what we're dealing with when we're talking about respiration is the axial skeleton and all the things that attach to that. Because so much can be influenced by the degree of respiration that we are undergoing, that we can make incredible changes at the axial skeleton. First, let's talk rib cage. And our most important guy that we're going to talk about when we discuss the rib cage is the diaphragm. And the reason why this muscle is so important and so impactful is because it separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Thus, because of its attachments, it can influence both of these cavities. So we're talking about one muscle that could potentially impact me from here down. That's remarkable. That's why the diaphragm is so important. Let's look at these two pictures right here. So what you can see is the diaphragm attaches alongside the rib cage. It has attachments to the lumbar spine, and of course we have this big old central tendon in the middle in which the diaphragm is attached to. Now, both of these pictures are not necessarily accurate because what we have to understand is that this diaphragm is asymmetrical. You can see on both of these pictures that the central tendon of the diaphragm is a little bit different on the left side versus the right side. You can also see on the picture on the right that the attachments on the lumbar spine on the right side go a little bit farther down than they do on the left side of the diaphragm. This is normal. Why do you guys think that is? That normal asymmetry that we see in the diaphragm is due to our internal anatomy. On the right side, we got this big old honkin' liver, which allows the right diaphragm to be a little bit more effective from a doming standpoint. On the left side, we have a heart that's pushing down on the diaphragm. So that makes it a little bit flatter and limits its doming capabilities. These are important things to consider. This is probably a more accurate picture in this case. You can appreciate the asymmetry that we see in the diaphragm. As you can see on the right-hand side, that diaphragm is a little bit higher, a little bit more domed. On the left, it's a little bit shorter, a little bit flatter. This is normal. This, again, also exhibits some of that normal asymmetry in the diaphragm. And so you can see really well on this picture right here that the attachments on the lumbar spine are a little bit lower on the right, a little bit higher on the left. Here's how it works. So the diaphragm, when it contracts, the diaphragm descends, as is demonstrated on the left-handed portion of this picture when we take a breath of air in. The diaphragm descends. What that does to the rib cage is it laterally expands the rib cage outward, enhancing the bucket handle action of the lower aspect of the ribs. That's normal. When the diaphragm relaxes during exhalation, the diaphragm domes, the rib cage comes inward. So it expands on the inhalation, comes back together on the exhalation. That's from a respiration standpoint. If I contract the diaphragm from a muscular or a postural based standpoint, the diaphragm creates extension of the lumbar spine based on the attachments that we saw in previous pictures, such as this one right here. That's normal. Based on some of the studies that I've listed in this slide right here, the diaphragm doesn't really do much from a rotation or side bend standpoint. So think of it from a postural standpoint. When postural demands increase, diaphragm is going to extend the lumbar spine as it descends. Now, one key piece on here for respiration is the zone of apposition, which you can see I've outlined on this picture on the right. Now, what the zone of apposition is the amount of diaphragm tissue that lies adjacent to the rib cage. So, if I have a maximal zone of apposition, 60% of the diaphragm tissue can lie adjacent to about 40% of the rib cage. When the zone of apposition is at its highest, I can achieve maximal inhalation and I can achieve maximal exhalation. And gas exchange is at its finest. With a lot of the interventions that we're going to be trying to perform via breathing, this is what we're going after. Here's how we get it. We use muscles of exhalation to set the rib cage, anchor the lower portion of the rib cage in such a fashion that the diaphragm can fully dome and that when it descends, it doesn't allow the rib cage to flare out insofar that the diaphragm descends too far. Because if the diaphragm descends too far, we can't develop an effective exhalation due to alteration in length-tension relationships of the abdominal muscles. And because the diaphragm is so contracted, it has a hard time relaxing all the way to achieve a full zone of apposition. Now, there's several muscles in the abdominal region that help us with exhalation. These two muscles in particular are kind of poor at helping us achieve that zone of apposition. So first we have the rectus abdominis. Since it only attaches to some of the costal cartilage and the xiphoid process, it really only can flex the thorax to a very small degree. ZOA acquisition or zone of apposition acquisition is a triplanar movement. And if I have a guy who can only do sagittal plane actions, it's going to be very tough for us to achieve a zone of apposition. The external obliques are also not that great at achieving a zone of apposition. Well, these guys can frontal plane-wise compress the rib cage in, which is desirable, due to the line of pull of the external obliques this way. It also pulls the rib cage a bit forward when acting alone. This pulling of the rib cage forward keeps the front ribs facing this way and into a degree of external rotation. If the ribs are externally rotated, the zone of apposition cannot be fully attained. So while these guys are important, acting alone, they're not the most effective at giving us a zone of apposition. These bad boys, on the other hand, are. So on the left-hand side, we have the internal oblique. What this does is it pulls the rib cage back. It pulls the rib cage kind of down and back, assuming it's in a good position. This allows for the diaphragm to dome a bit more effectively. The transversus abdominis is also very important because what this does is it compresses the rib cage a bit inward because it attaches on the innermost aspect of the rib cage. So we have a muscle on the left, the internal obliques, that pulls the rib cage down and back. The the lower portion. And then the transversus abdominis helps pull things in so the diaphragm can ascend effectively and a zone of apposition can be achieved. And especially when the diaphragm descends, we want these two muscles to anchor the rib cage as effectively as possible so it does not descend too far. That will allow for a full zone of apposition to be achieved once exhalation occurs and the diaphragm can maximally dome, allowing for effective gas exchange. While this is going on, and this is how we can link diaphragm activity to what's going on with our innominate and our pelvis. The pelvic floor mirrors the diaphragm, although the actions are a little bit different. And the reason why this is because the pelvic floor is active at the same time as the abdominal muscles. So this is also a muscle of exhalation. In a perfect world, these two diaphragms, you can call the pelvic floor a pelvic diaphragm as well because it's not something that's really flat, it is domed. These two diaphragms in a perfect world should stay over the top of one another. And so as I take a breath of air in and the diaphragm flattens, the abdominal viscera are going to push out in a 360-degree fashion. This is why eccentric abdominal activity is so important, because we need to disperse the internal organs all around the abdominal region so we can achieve intra-abdominal pressure. Displacement of the pelvic viscera is also important. And so when I get the bladder, the genitals, all of these things pressing down, the pelvic floor also flattens. So it becomes eccentrically active. And so when I breathe in, this happens. Right there. This allows for a canister effect and expansion of the abdominal contents in 360 degrees and intra-abdominal pressure to be attained. When I exhale, the pelvic floor contracts and ascends. This helps push the diaphragm back up into its domed position. This is a good thing. Now, what can happen is if I lack a zone of apposition and this diaphragm up top goes a little bit too far down and pushes a little bit forward, we'll see the exact opposite occur at the pelvic floor. So an anterior pelvic tilt results due to an alteration of pressure in the abdominal cavity. So this is how we can see this guy right here, this thoracic diaphragm, can have a profound impact on the abdominal cavity, which is bordered on the inferior aspect by our pelvic floor. Thus we can see how many areas can be affected by the way we breathe. So here's another picture to kind of illustrate that. So diaphragm contracts, the abdominal muscles, relax is probably not the best term, but they are eccentrically active because the abdominal contents are pushing out into it, and though it's not illustrated on this picture, the pelvic floor descends because the pelvic viscera push down into it. When I exhale, the abdominal muscles contract, pulling the rib cage down, back, and in. The pelvic floor ascends, which creates a relative posterior pelvic tilt. Diaphragm ascends. This is normal circumstances of breathing. If you like what you heard and you'd like to access the remaining hour of the talk, as well as a 27-page handout, both free, click on the link below, subscribe to the newsletter, get access to a bunch of other free goodies, another free talk, all types of cool things, and become a part of the fam. I hope to see you there. Deuces!